I gave him lots of heads up about that name. I changed the title of this lesson 3 times. The last change was made about 2 hours ago. I couldn't decide exactly. We studied the book of Ecclesiastes on a Wednesday night, as I recall, not too terribly long ago. And it was one of my favorite studies because Ecclesiastes is so rich. And I want us to go back and look at one particular passage from that book this morning. We'll begin by reading it together. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, the first 10 verses. A good name is better than precious ointment. The day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This is all vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. I don't know about you, but that's quite a collection. There are statements there that just seem absolutely wrong when we think about our human judgments and perceptions. And so I want us to look at 6 statements that are made in this passage and talk about why they are so profoundly, not only correct, but profoundly wise. The first one is, a good name is better than precious ointment. Now, that one doesn't seem so unusual. That seems right. How valuable is a good name? Well, let me ask you this. You probably can't hardly even see that. That is a t-shirt. And it's got the little symbol on there that tells me it is a Under Armour. I wanted to say Armor All, and I knew that wasn't right. It is an Under Armour t-shirt. You can be the proud owner of an Under Armour t-shirt for the small sum of $35, or you can buy 6 Hanes t-shirts for $25. Why the difference? Well, you're paying for the name. You're paying. I remember when I was in school, we've got our 50-year reunion. I remember when I was in school that if you had enough money, you could actually get a shirt that had a little gator on it. See, there's enough old people in here who remember. So, there is value in a name, and a good name. So I hear a lot of you talk at the end of church. Where are we going to lunch? You know, if they said, you know, well, we're thinking about going to, what is that, Roadhouse? That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Then there's some others that would say, I think what we need to do instead, there's a difference in the name, isn't there? The name conjures up things in your mind for you to think about. And there are lots of biblical examples about good names and bad names. You know, we can talk about the good names. David, a man after God's own heart, with all of the terrible things that we know about David, he still comes away with a name that is precious. And we can talk about Paul, and we know all of the good things that he did and all of the things that he wrote. Abraham, when you think about, if somebody asks you, who are the most prominent, powerful, positive people talked about in the Bible after Jesus, you know, Moses and David and Paul and Abraham, there would be a fairly concise list of names that probably all of us would come up with. But there's also some names in the Scripture. They're not so good. When's the last time you ever heard anybody name their son Nabal? Or for that matter, Cain? Or Judas? I told Lisa last night there is I forget what he is, a runner or an athlete or something, whose last name is Sinner. She said, how does it spelled? I said, S-I-N-N-E-R. That's unfortunate. He's a famous sinner. You know, when we talk about Nabal, in 1 Samuel 25, Abigail, Nabal's wife, said this to David about her husband. Please let not my Lord regard the scoundrel Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. He couldn't even get a good rep from his wife. His name is ridiculous. That's the way he will be remembered from Scripture. The second thing that we find in this passage is the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Kind of fascinating, isn't it? Something to think about. And a couple of these, I read them and I thought, okay, so what could that possibly mean? One commentator said that the first half of this verse, that a good name is better than precious ointment, could not have possibly prepared us for the second half of this verse. That now we get a body blow. And that even the day of one's birth is ominous, despite all of the hopes and potentials that comes with the birth of a new baby, that children are supposed to come into this world and is supposed to be glorious, and they utter a human sound. Their first sound is a scream. One commentator said, before ever a child speaks, he prophesies by his tears of his ensuing sorrows. Kind of fascinating to think about. And while you and I both know that there are many people who mourn at the times of death, that's not true for everybody. You know, when Paul talks about his own life, in Philippians chapter 1, he says, you know, for me to die is gain. And he talks about, you know, what a emotional challenge it is for him to decide whether or not to stay in this life or to go on to the next one, where he's going to get such a great reward. He says, in spite of the fact that I'd like to go on home, I have to stay with you, because there's more work that needs to be done. And then he said in 2 Timothy 4, I'm now ready to be poured out like a drink offering. Here's my departure. Here's why this is a good thing that I've reached the end, because it's been good for me to have this opportunity and to know what lies ahead and what the Lord, the righteous judge, is going to give me, and not to me only, but everybody who is going to love his coming. You ever been around a Jewish funeral? They celebrate. They mourn at birth. They celebrate death. Charles Spurgeon, the famous preacher, once said that death is the end of dying. I never heard that phrase before. Kind of like that, actually. Death is the end of dying. You know, in recent times, I have heard, and probably even said, I've heard parents and grandparents talk about how concerned they were about what was going to be left in our world for their kids and their grandkids. What kind of life were they coming into, and what was it going to be like? The challenges that they would be facing. Here's what we know from the preacher in Ecclesiastes. At death, all the challenges end. At death, the battle's over. At death, the victory has been won. Interestingly, the ancients talked about the martyrs in a unique way. They said that when the martyrs died, that was their birthday. That when the martyrs died, that was their birthday. Kind of profound to think about what that means for their future. And then in Revelation, I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord." We know that that's the case. And in our study of Revelation, we're already getting to see a little bit about what heaven looks like and what's going on and why that becomes such an important scene for you and I to think about. The third one, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. Sorrow is better than laughter. Now, I don't know about you. Yeah, Vicki? I don't know. It seems that the preacher in Ecclesiastes has rejected any hope whatsoever of finding the pleasures in this life. And when we think about how the challenges that you and I face, that there is sickness, that there is the possibility of loss. It can be things we value, it can be our health, it can be tragedy. Do you remember a historically tragic day? September the 11th of 2001, 7:14 a.m. Central Time. We got the word that the tower had been struck. September 11, 2001, 7:14 a.m. Do you remember where you were? Of course you do. Do you remember what it was like for the next few days after that? People all of a sudden were deciding that maybe I need to go to church. They wanted to worship. They wanted to pray. They wanted to come together. They wanted to hold hands. They wanted to light candles. They wanted to sing. And for a whole, 72 hours we came together. I'm not a real fan of country music. I listen to it some. It's not my favorite. But there is a song that I wanted to share with you. It's called "Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning?" Yeah, country fans. Where were you when the world stopped turning that September day? Were you in the yard with your wife and children or working on some stage in L.A.? Did you stand there in shock at the sight of that black smoke rising against the blue sky? Did you shout out in anger, in fear for your neighbor, or did you just sit down and cry? Did you weep for the children? They lost their dear loved ones. Pray for the ones who don't know. Did you rejoice for the people who walked from the rubble and sob for the ones left below? Did you burst out with pride for the red, white, and blue and the heroes who died just doing what they do? Did you look up to heaven for some kind of answer and look at yourself and what really matters? Where were you when the world stopped turning that September day? Teaching a class full of innocent children or driving home from some cold interstate? Did you feel guilty because you were a survivor? In a crowded room, did you feel alone? Did you call up your mother and tell her you love her? Did you dust off that Bible at home? Did you open your eyes and hope it never happened? Close your eyes and not go to sleep? Did you notice the sunset for the first time in ages? And speak to some stranger on the street? Did you lay down at night and think of tomorrow and go out and buy a gun? Did you turn off that violent old movie you're watching and turn on the I Love Lucy rerun? Did you go to church, hold hands with some strangers, stand in line to give your own blood? Did you just stay home and cling tight to your family? Thank God you had somebody to love. I'm just a singer of simple songs. I'm not a real political man. I watch CNN, but I'm not sure I can tell you the difference in Iraq and Iran. But I know Jesus, and I talk to God. And I remember this from when I was young. Faith, hope, and love are some good things He gave us. And the greatest of these is love. It was a period of deep mourning, of fear, of hurt, of anger, of sorrow. And the ecclesiastical writer may be right. We learned a lot. It made us look at ourselves. It made us look at others. And loss and tragedy can do that. Some of the ancient monks, we're told, read their Bibles with a candle that was stuck in a skull and said, "The light from a death's head may be an awful one, but boy, is it very profitable." Following these kinds of events, we learn what we need to learn from sorrow. An opinion whose one that I value greatly said something to me last Lord's Day. Wasn't a great day for me. As I was leaving, or standing down here, a person came up and offered one word of advice: pivot, and walked away. I thought about that a lot this week. There are times when that's the only thing we can do, is pivot and move forward. And when James says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Know that the testing of your faith works patience." My patience was tested. And we're not completely healed yet. But we're still pivoting, trying to move on. Number 4, it's better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than to the song of fools. That verse goes on to say, "For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool." 2 Samuel chapter 12 talks about what advice can look like. And I want us to notice 2 examples. One is an example that turns out to be a good example of advice. And the second example is one that wasn't such a great example of advice. Here's what it said. And this is what happens when David is told about his plot after Bathsheba and the killing of her husband. What that means. Nathan, the Lord sent Nathan to David, came to him, said to him, "There were 2 men in the city, one rich, one poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing except for one little lamb, which he bought and nourished, and grew up together with him with his children. And it ate of his own food, drank of his own cup, lay in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. A traveler came to the rich, who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd to prepare one for the wayfaring man who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, this man who's done this shall surely die. And he shall restore 4-fold for the lamb, because he did this thing and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, "You are that man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul." Now the reaction that we find out about David from this, that he listened to what was said. But do you remember what happened to him? You know, we have numerous chapters after 2 Samuel 12, like chapters something like 13 through 24, that outlines the terrible things that happened to David after he committed this grievous act. It wasn't just the situation with Bathsheba, it was everything that happened after that. And you remember all the terrible things that he encountered as a result of that. You remember the end, though? Finally repented. We have chapters in Psalms that talks about how gravely he felt about what he had done. There are people in our lives that we ought to listen to. There are those, Solomon, just like the wise man said, you know, there are some people who will give you good advice, and you should listen to them because they are wise. Solomon knew that that wasn't always the case, though. And we see in 1 Kings chapter 12, the second example of someone who was considered to be a good, wise counselor who gave bad advice. And the king Rehoboam consults the elders. And he said, if you will be a servant to these people and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever. That's what the older advisors told him. He rejected that advice which the elders had given, consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him, and he said, what advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me? Listen, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on us. The people were unhappy with his father. And so the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him and said, thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, your father made the yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Then you shall say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist, and now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I'm going to add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, and I will chastise you with scourges. You see what he did? He got two pieces of advice. One from the older counselors who said, if you'll be good to them, they will follow you. The younger guy said, make it even tougher on them. And we know what happens. It wind up splitting the nation. That's what he did. And half of the nation went to him, and the other half, this is where the creation of Jeroboam, and here's where we have the two kingdoms come into play. On the one hand, though, we have David who listened to the wise counsel and turned back to God. On the other hand, we have this example of where he made such a horrible decision. Who do we listen to? Well, we got to learn to listen to wise people. And that's what verse 7, Solomon gave us a warning. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason. There are times when things seem so horrible that we lose all sense of judgment. We make bad calls. We take bad decisions. Considered to be one of the greatest advisors of all. I asked Caleb to read that passage. That the man who had given the advice, considered to be one of the great, he was a friend of David's. His advice was considered to be from God. Gave terrible advice to Absalom. Go in and sleep with your father's concubines, with your father's wife. And what did he do? He pitched a tent on top of the building where all of Israel could see what he was doing. And oh, by the way, he turns out to be Bathsheba's grandfather. Just a little side note. The end of a matter is better than the beginning. The end of a matter is better than the beginning. I had to think about this one because there are examples of that, I think. And when we think about in Ecclesiastes, vanity, the word vanity shows up in 30 different verses and more than 40 times in those verses. Solomon keeps coming back and saying, look, I've tried this, I've looked for this, as looking for love, and he's looking for pleasures in all the wrong places. Do we share with others what they need to hear? In Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13, I think my favorite verse in the book of Ecclesiastes. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man. Out of all of the things that he could have heard, out of all of the things that he had been told, out of all of the things that he tried and experienced, Solomon knew all of it was vanity. There was only one thing that was really going to matter, and that was it. Ultimately. And then the final of the statements in this passage is that patience of spirit is better than haughtiness of spirit. And in Philippians, when Paul says, I rejoiced in you greatly at your last care you flourished, that through you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regard of need. I've learned to be content. I know how to have things be great. I know how to have things be terrible. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Who was it in your life that you remember as being patient? My dad, I always considered to be pretty patient until he wasn't. Those periods were obvious and infrequent. My grandfather, who was about yay tall, one of the more patient people I've ever met. I never heard my grandfather get fired up about anything except when the Cardinals lost. My grandfather always seemed wise. You and I have to learn what it means to live in the here and now. And as the proverb says, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. And he who rules his spirit is the one who will take the city. Patience. There are things that challenge our patience. There are days where we have to say to ourselves, just pivot. We need a plan for the future. And we need to expect it not to be perfect. That there are going to be some horrible days in the future. But what we do know is God is perfect all the time and knows what's best for us. And when Paul says, don't be angry, don't sin, don't let the sun go down on your head, because it gives a place to the devil. And the devil is active, and he works. And that we have to be patient. Unlike Saul's wife, or Lot's wife, we have to be patient. Because if we don't, they may someday make a monument about us. So here are your statements. A good name's better than ointment. One's death is better than one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than feasting. Sorrow is better than laughter. Better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man to be singing with the songs of fools. The end is better than the beginning, and patience of spirit is better than haughtiness. Why? Because when we ignore these things, we give place to the devil. I don't think I've ever used the lyrics from 2 songs in one sermon. That's exactly what I'm about to do. There is a song called "The Devil is Alive and Well" by Brad Paisley. I've never heard this song, but the words are kind of interesting. Surf the web, turn on the news, same old story every day. Hateful words we all use. So much anger, so much pain, from the darkest prison to the largest church, sometimes for fortune, sometimes for fame. It's ironic that some of the worst things are done in God's name. They can debate what's real, what's right, what's true, what's sent from up above. All I know is I'd be leery of anything that isn't based in love. Because God is love. I don't know if you believe in heaven. I don't know if you believe in hell, but I bet we can agree that the devil is alive and well. We have to remember that when we ignore things like the wisdom that comes from Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes, or the things that we learn from Proverbs, that there is such great wisdom that helps you and I to know how to live our life every day. One of the descriptions that I found of this passage said that these are practical pieces of wisdom. I like that. Because there wasn't anything there, it's not relevant for you and me. It's the challenges that we face all the time. Knowing that Satan is alive and well, and we can't give him a place. This morning, if you're here and you have some need to respond to the invitation, we want to give you that opportunity. If you've never been baptized, let's do that today. Let's set you on the journey to the next life. That this would be like the martyr said, this would be your birthday. Because you've put to death the old man of sin. And for the rest of us who are Christians, we have those moments in our life. It might be the remembrance of where you were the day you heard that John Kennedy had been shot. It may be when you hear about things like 9/11. It may be that the announcement that there is a virus that is sweeping the world that is deadly. There are so many events that help us to stop in time and think about what's going on. And hopefully will cause us to remember who God is and how good He is, and most importantly, what He has in store for us. If you have a need to ask for prayers, for forgiveness, or for strength, we invite you to come right now as together we stand as we sing this song.